Welcome to the Politics People. We're joined today by the president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, a think tank dedicated to applying economic analysis to the great issues of the day. He's the author of a number of books, first coming to international prominence with his 2001 bestseller, The Skeptical Environmentalist. His latest book, False Alarm, tells us how climate change panic has cost us trillions, hurts the poor, and fails to fix the planet. I'm talking today to Dr. Bjorn Lomborg. Thank you so much for doing this.
Hey, Paul, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Are you aware of the influence that you've had on politics and policy?
So that's a hard question to ask because obviously I know that some people have both read what I say and been influenced by it. I think a lot of people mostly sort of define themselves in opposition to what I'm saying. But I hope that what I'm trying to do is really just make sure that we realize what the costs and the benefits are of our different choices. And what we try to do with the Copenhagen Consensus and what I tried to do with the new book on False Alarm is really just say, look, if you make political choices, there are both costs and there are benefits involved. That's true for pretty much anything you want to do in politics or anywhere else in the world. And you should know what those costs and what those benefits are. And unfortunately, many of the climate policies that we're right now enacting have huge costs and do very little to actually help both the climate and people. And often they'll end up hurting, especially poor people, hence the subtitle. And I think that conversation is important. And yes, I think that makes a lot of people angry, but I think it's also important to have that conversation.
That's I suppose, what I'm driving at. And I definitely want to delve into the latest book because I think I've followed your work since The Skeptical Environmentalist avidly.
Oh, thank you.
And I find this book is the most direct, I think. This is me as a total layman thinking that you have started The Skeptical Environmentalist, and everybody should read it, I think is a very data-heavy academic tome made book, if you like. It's the brief history of time for the environmental generation, I think, is my take on it.
Yeah.
Okay. I might be oversimplifying. It seems to me that after 20 years, people are still not getting the fantastic, simple, erudite conclusion that you've reached. And so this latest book is like, look, we're putting it on the cover now, okay? I'm literally telling you on the cover what the problem is. There an evolution in the simplifying of the message that you've adopted over the years?
Well, I think there's different time for different things. I just put out this spring an academic article that's 37 pages long with lots and lots of arguments that have much of the same point, but in a much more academic fashion. I think there's an argument to both, make the full and erudite argument, as you say, but also trying to make the fairly simple and straightforward argument. And I think False Alarm is probably a more straightforward argument for a couple of reasons. Partly, I was incredibly fortunate to have Laura as my editor, and I've never had such a good editor. She kept telling me, no, this is good, but you can do it better. Scratch. Start from,
Okay.
So this is certainly the best written book I've ever done, and I think that's also helped making it a lot clearer and a lot more straightforward. It's cut away all the, oh, did you know, interesting side fact, and just, straight down the main road, this is the argument. So I think there's partly that. The other part is also, remember 20 years ago when I started this conversation, global warming was sort of one of many, many concerns. To many people in the rich world, global warming has become this existential, all life dominating issue. So last year, YouGov asked people in 28 countries about global warming. They asked them, do you believe that this is going to lead to the extinction of the human race? Almost half the world's population is now answering, yes, that is likely. So we've also moved from, oh, this is important, to, oh my God, we're all going to die sort of thing. And if you're going to get hold of a lot of those people who I think rightly have concluded, I'm reading a terrible story every day in the newspaper, or several stories every day in the newspaper about how global warming is going to make my world, and certainly my kids' world, totally unlivable. Of course you conclude this is the end of the world, but you also need to get them the information that possibly you have been oversold in this. And obviously that's my argument, that you've actually been dramatically oversold. You need to get that argument, but you also need to get it in a form that people are willing to listen to.
And look, if anybody isn't familiar with the argument that you put forward, and please correct me because I'm sure I'm oversimplifying it and this interview will be a disaster. What came out of the traps for me in 2001? It was that simple observation that climate change is real, but it's just one of many factors that we can actually adapt to. The world's in a better position actually than it was in the 60s. There's a lot to be optimistic about. We definitely have problems, but global warming is like number 8 on a list of top 10 of world problems. That's kind of my schoolboy analysis if I was precising your work. Is that fair enough?
Well, it's somewhat fair. Allow me to just make a slight modification. I think the skeptical environmentalist was more about saying, look, fundamentally, on pretty much all accounts, things are getting better, not worse. So air pollution is getting better. We don't starve. We get more literate. There's pretty much any area where you care to look at human flourishing, we're doing better, not worse. And that's very counter to the idea that we have this is, the world is just going to hell in a handcart, is the expression, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it's important to get that fundamental fact across a wide range of areas, because if you realize that mostly we fix more problems as a human species than we make new ones, it makes it a lot easier for us to not be scared and overwhelmed and actually start being smart. If you think the world is ending tomorrow, obviously nothing else matters. If you realize there's a very good chance that things are going to be better tomorrow and better the day after, but there's still lots of problems, then suddenly you start becoming much more rational. So the skeptical environmentalist was much more about, first, setting the agenda. Look, things are getting better, not worse. There are still problems. Global warming is one of them. There are many other problems, and we should tackle them, but smartly. So let's not do stuff that makes us feel good, but is incredibly costly. Let's do stuff that actually does good and is fairly inexpensive. That's the basic point that I've been trying to make, and it still is the point that I'm trying to make.
Absolutely. And it is, as you say, still the point that I don't think you're trying to make. You're making it. What fascinates me, this show is about the reaction people have got, and it's your role as a player in this world as opposed to the nitty-gritty of the detail. I'm interested in the reaction you got, because for me, just as a reader of the book, and I got it, I got it from the title immediately, and like I said, I think it's probably the last book I read. I can't say, but the reaction you got as a scientist, because this came as a statistical research. This was a weighty tome based on statistics. This is data driven. And my understanding is it wasn't the answer you were expecting to get at the beginning of the research. You were, I believe, trying to refute some blowhard in America that was saying that there was no such thing as global warming. Were you surprised with your previous statistician hat on or your scientific hat on? You present this tome, and the fact that it got such it was lauded, but it got such criticism as well. You got such brickbats for it. Were you surprised at that reaction?
Oh God, yes. I mean, I was a totally naive professor from University of Aarhus, a pretty good university, but nobody ever heard of it, I think, in the world. And look, I just thought, this is interesting. I thought everything is going to hell, and actually most of the data tells us it's not. That's interesting. That's why I wrote a book. First, I wrote some articles, then I wrote a book, and then it became The Skeptical Environmentalist in English. And I thought people would be like, oh, that's interesting. But clearly, that's not the only conversation. It's not just a question about truth. It's also a question of who gets to say what we should be scared about. Because at the end of the day, if you're incredibly scared about something, you're much more likely to say, yeah, let's spend a lot of money on it. And it's important to recognize this is not just something that happens within climate. If you talk to any doctors, they'll tell you, if we don't spend more on our healthcare system, we'll all die for this, that, or the other reason. Or, our teachers will tell you, spend more on education, or your kids are going to be dumb. Or, there's always these kinds of exaggerations, and it makes sense. That's what interest groups do. And obviously, green groups would like us to spend more money on the environment. So they tell us, if you don't spend money on environment, we're all going to die. But the problem is when everybody ends up screaming, spend here or you're going to die, we are paralyzed as a society. So my attempt was to try and say, look, if you look at the data, we can actually stop hyperventilating. We can start thinking smartly about this and look across all these different areas and all these different problems and say, where can you spend resources and do the most good? But if you say that, obviously that's going to annoy every single person who's actually arguing for a project that relies on fear. And especially, of course, if it turns out the analysis tells us that's not actually a very good investment. That's, the thing you do is a really poor use of resources. It's not surprising those people are going to be like really annoyed. It doesn't mean we shouldn't say it, but I totally understand now why they got all annoyed. But when I published that book, I was just like, blue-eyed and thinking, hey, isn't this wonderful? Here's lots of great information. Don't you love it? And I was a little taken back by a lot of people saying, stop saying that.
It's true. We think we're so sophisticated. I always think of like Galileo just going, it's fine. Do you know what? I figured it out. We're not in the middle. It's still fine. We're not in the middle. We're sort of like third planet out. It's fine, but all good. And then, you get thrown out by religious zealots, and that's how it feels that the climate change a lot of other discussions now have taken on the religious mantle. But I do think that in modern day politics, that with climate change led the way in becoming a religion as opposed to being a transfer or an exchange of data and information. And that's why you stick out to me, because like I said, I don't think you're saying anything controversial at all, even if I agree with you and did from the off. But I was relieved actually at your presence. But even if I didn't agree with you, it's like, okay, he's just saying the world's in a better place than it was, and things are getting better. But there is something that's very exercised with your critics, and I don't want to dwell on them. I'm just saying that the reaction seems disproportionate to the actual information that you're imparting.
Yeah, I think there's two reasons for that. I mean, I like to believe that one of the reasons is that I actually make a really good and cogent argument. And obviously, if somebody comes around and make a really muddled argument that the favorite thing that you're campaigning for is not a good use of money, I don't care all that much. But if somebody actually makes a really good argument for why you're not worth spending a lot of money on, I can understand that you get a lot more upset. So I think my opponents at least partly get very upset because I do a good job. But I also think that there is a sense in which climate change, unlike almost any other thing that we're talking about on the planet, has this potential to become, I'm not going to go there and say that it's a religious thing, but I certainly get what you're saying. And I think it has these religious overtones. It is incredibly fulfilling to know that you're working on saving the world. It's much, much more fun than you're trying to, in my organization, we try to say our goal is to try to make things slightly less worse. So we're trying to, move it a little bit in the right direction. And obviously that's not nearly as much fun as actually, being part of saving the world. It's also much more fun for newspapers because they get to sell you the most clickable story. You're going to die if you don't do this, that, and the other. Whereas the reality would be, things are going to be slightly tougher in 50 years on these rather marginal issues. That's not something that people are going to click on. And then finally, it is wonderful for politicians. Remember, politicians live off of selling you solutions to problems and basically getting your vote in exchange. And they actually get to say, the world is ending, but if you vote for me, I can make it go away. And even better, they get to say, we're going to spend a lot of money in the election cycle after next, which of course means they get to get all the votes and all the applause, and then somebody else will end up paying out of their nose. That is the ideal setup for something where we end up being incredibly scared because the media, the green organizations, and the politicians all have a common outcome of simply saying, let's scare people because it gives better ratings, it gives more votes, and it gives more funding. But it's not necessarily a good way to have a good conversation.
You personally, you actually have studied politics as well. Before Skeptical Environmentalist, didn't you you studied in the US, I think?
So I'm a political scientist specializing in economics now and in statistics when I was teaching at the university. So political science fundamentally means a little bit of everything. So we know some things, but we're not amazing at any one thing. And I think that's in some ways helps me a lot because I can pull in information from a lot of different areas. But all the stuff that I present, I'm very careful to say this is not me saying that. Why would you believe a political scientist telling you this? This is what the world's only climate Nobel economist tells you. This is what the world's leading authority on climate change, like the UN Climate Panel, is telling you. So these are the leading authorities that we have on all these areas, and that's the information that I try to pull out and basically put together so it becomes easier for us to make sense of the global warming conversation.
Yeah, it's again sort of reading your biogs and the Wikipedias of this world, etc. You have a handle on with political science. You see how the sausages are actually made. You can actually see the extrapolation of how your work and others like you can be utilized exactly in that way you've summed up to. I'm going to save the world. If you vote for me, I will save your world for you. I was going to ask you, since Skeptical Environmentalist, have your politics, your personal politics, changed at all? Have you gone from right to left or left to right, or have you had any kind of epiphany or Damascene conversion?
Uh, so I guess I've had two experiences. One is that most politicians, since I've had a chance to interact with lots of them, are pretty well informed and actually want to do good. I think contrary to what many people believe about at least their opponents. I'm sort of a slight left wing guy in Scandinavia. So for most of the U.S. audience, I would certainly be to the left of most Democrats, which I think surprises a lot of people. But I somewhat reluctantly admit it because I think it shouldn't be relevant for what I'm actually talking about, because I'm not talking about what the politics should be. I'm simply talking about, if you look at the effectiveness of different policies, what works and what doesn't. And that, what's smart shouldn't be a Democrat or a Republican trait, but simply what's a smart thing to do and something that Republicans and Democrats could agree on. But with that said, I have to say I've also realized that for many politicians, while they certainly understand this and they know a lot of what I'm saying, they also often, very blatantly realize they're just going to get more out of doing something that's dumb for political reasons. So I had this one encounter with what was the future Prime Minister of Denmark a couple of weeks before she got elected, and they ran a campaign that they were going to defund me. And I told her, I should just say she's denied this, but I mean, I was there. So,
Right.
She, we were I'd just come out from a studio. She was waiting to go in, and I came up and talked to her and say hi and stuff. And I told her, would you like me to come by and tell you and your parliamentary group, the Social Democrats, what we're actually doing? Because I think you'll like a lot of this. And she looked at me sort of a little sly smile, and she said, Bjorn, I'm sure that's true, but I just get so much more out of trashing you in public. Yeah,
Oh.
which I thought was very surprisingly honest. But also, of course, what tells you that for a lot of politicians, they're not going to do the right thing unless it's either convenient or through good arguments that we make lots of people convinced this is what we need to do.
That's chilling to me. You see, that's the thing. You're just too good humored and good natured about all this. I'm with you. I think most politicians I've met over the years, and I've met the biggest, except presidents, I think, they set out to do good. The motive is to do good. I absolutely believe that from either side. But I do believe that exactly as you've described there, to do good, their political expedience will make them make decisions that have to try and do the most good for the most people, and that is obviously winning elections or whatever. And I think to boil it down to I get so much more out of our relationship by attacking you or whatever, it sort of sums up the dilemma with a lot of politics.
But again, I agree with you, and I would love for us to be able to come up with a better idea. Churchill used to say democracy is the worst of all kinds of government, except all the others. And I think that's the right way to think about this. I look at what politicians do, and I just think, oh my God, there's no way I would have the patience or the willingness. They have to go through so much, and they get humiliated, and they get pushed by everybody. I have great respect for them, even though I would love them to do a better job.
Oh, ditto. I total respect. Again, doing this podcast, people think I'm sort of having to go at politicians. I really like them. I totally get I would like people to be better informed, I think, ultimately, or to understand that there is what, just having the data, just having a point of view isn't enough. You have to weaponize that, if you like, in the world if you want it to become effective. It's not just good enough to sit at home and come up with a formula. You've actually got to, as you've done, crystallize it and package it and get it out there. I was going to ask you, do you know of people that you've converted? Have you had anybody that was violently opposed to you who has eventually come round? I'm asking this, I should ask it in two ways. But I was an agent in the UK for a long time in entertainment. And I used to represent this guy who was kind of like the face of environmentalism in the UK in the early 2000s. And I remember when your book came out, I gave your book to like newspaper editors and stuff. I literally sent it out to loads of newspaper editors going like, this is the stuff I've been banging on about. This guy, this is what really sort of like surprised me. This guy, I gave him a copy of the book as well. But he ended up sort of slicing it out with, separating all the pages out, and him and a lot of his supporters, etc., went through it line by line to try and find, like, oh, actually there were 12 penguins, not 11. Another lie. It's all this kind of analysis. I'm just saying, he is unconvertible. He's absolutely unconvertible. That's fine. Are you conscious that you've actually had anybody have the penny drop in front of you that, oh, is that all you're saying? Oh, yeah, that's fine. And therefore they can perhaps be better informed about the actual state of the planet?
So yes, I mean, I have this actually routinely when I go out and give talks. I almost every time get someone that comes up to me afterwards and say, "I thought you were going to be horrible. I thought you were going to be the devil. I thought you were going to be wrong. I thought I was going to hate you." And one or more of those claims, and then they say, "But it actually makes a lot of sense." This is not to say that they've ended up saying, "All right, I'm just wholeheartedly behind Bjorn now," but I think they realize that's not a crazy perspective. That actually has some sense. This is going to linger in my mind and annoy me because I can hear parts of this being correct. And then of course I in my sort of professional interaction, I've met with quite a number of people who have been very affected. But there's also lots of them that have sort of reverted back. Branson is one person who actually read the Skeptical Environmentalist, and he's publicly stated. I've never met him, but he's publicly stated he read it and it really affected his mind. But then when Al Gore came and told him that that Al Gore was much more right, Branson realized yes, the Skeptical Environmentalist was wrong, and Gore was right. I've also had some other people. Unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to tell you their names, but really influential people who really have changed their minds on this. So yes, it has had an impact. I think to a large extent, it's also simply made the conversation a little more sensible because it's become more okay for everyone else to say, but look, shouldn't we talk about the costs and benefits? It's such an obvious question. So what we do right now is actually very little with what we're talking about specifically in climate. What I do now with my think tank is very much we are working right now with Ghana, but we work with poor countries around the world. to look at what are the best way to spend extra resources. So we're working with Ghana to say, to what extent should you be focusing on getting better roads, or should you be doing something about your sanitation, or what about flooding that happens in Accra every year? Should we have better canals? Should you be focusing more on tuberculosis? Should you be? There's a ton of different things that you can do in a developing country, and some of them are incredibly good, and some of them are not. And so we work with politicians and everybody else to think about and do analysis on where can you spend an extra dollar or a cedi in Ghana and do the most good. And the amazing thing is, once you start making that very simple point, journalists start becoming more acquainted with saying, I'm sorry, whenever somebody comes with a new proposal, how much is that going to cost? And how much good is it going to do? It's not rocket science to ask that. And of course, in the climate conversation, what I'm trying to get everybody to ask is, that climate proposal, how much will it cost, and how much good will it do?
And I mean, you illustrate the point perfectly. I wouldn't expect anything less. You actually look at lots of areas of public life and public policy, and you aren't a one note expert. You happened upon climate change and it's the extrapolation, and you obviously you hit a nerve or a vein or whatever the vernacular is. Were you you didn't set out, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, you didn't set out to be any kind of climate change advocate or otherwise. I mean, this really was just another analysis along your academic route. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So, look, I thought for at least 10 years after I'd published The Skeptical Environmentalist that I was going to go back eventually and do the research that I really wanted to do, which is computer simulation and game theory. So, totally different thing that, a couple of 100 people, if I was lucky, would ever read. And I just realized, look, maybe what I should be doing is being that guy who says, who asks the impertinent question, what's the cost, what's the benefit? And because nobody really seems to want to make that question because it just annoys everybody, but it is ultimately incredibly important that we have that conversation. So yes, in some sense, I'd actually disagree with you a little bit. I appreciate you saying I'm not a one trick pony, isn't that the expression? But in some ways I am. But we use that trick in many different contexts. So we don't just say it for climate. We also say it for all these others. And of course, what happens is when you do this, for instance, in water and sanitation, the guys who do water and sanitation, which is basically building pumps or water pumps or toilets, one of the things we find is that sometimes it's much more effective to simply make information campaigns. They're much cheaper and they'll actually achieve much of the same purpose. But of course, the people who are building toilets don't like that because they want to build toilets. And it's the same thing all the way around. There's always resistance in every area to hearing what's the most effective, because the most effective is often not where you can hire most of your friends and spend most of the money and get a large chunk of the budget from the government. And again, it's not that I'm accusing anyone of being corrupt or anything, but I'm simply pointing out we're all, in that sense, we're resistant to change because we're worried, what if that change means I'm not going to have a job?
Well, that's fascinating to me. Yeah, and it's unconventional, but I will allow it. Yes, you can be a one-trick pony. It was a different trick that we were talking about. So yes, okay, you fine, have it. You are. I was going to ask, have you met resistance in other areas? And you're saying yes. This is just a byproduct of the field of science that you're in, by the sound of it. You present data, and special interest groups will always come forward and go, yeah, no, you're reading that wrong. That's all very well, but that's not going to work, basically. So that goes part and parcel with being is it off your statistics, your statistical?
No. It's insisting on cost benefit analysis. If you insist on saying money should be spent well, obviously all the people who don't spend it well are going to be your opponents. So it simply comes out of the fact that government budgets or philanthropic budgets or any other budget is rarely perfectly spent. That's the nature of the game. And we simply try and come and say, you could do more good for the same money. You could spend it differently. You could focus on different areas and end up doing much more good for your country, for your region, or for your the area that you worry about. And that naturally leads to some people getting really annoyed. But it also, of course, leads to a lot of people who are really pleased. Partly the people who are arguing for things that get almost no publicity, but also, of course, for the people who actually want to help to do good. One thing that that I'm very, very proud of we helped push through was we've had a concerted effort to get more nutrition to especially to small children. So we started back in 2004 and pointing out that this has an incredible benefit. I'm just going to give you the very short version of this. It turns out that if you can get good nutrition to small kids, so basically from 0 to 2 years of age, it will develop their brains better so that when they go to school, even if it's a crappy school, which it very likely will be, especially in a third world setting, they will learn more, they will stay longer in school, and then when they come out, they will become more productive members of society. Turns out that it's fairly cheap to give the food, and it makes a huge impact in productivity. Moreover, and there's this wonderful study from Guatemala where they somewhat inadvertently ended up making an experiment. They gave some kids in some small rural villages good food and some kids not good food. Our researchers went back and refound those kids 40 years later. And it turns out that you can see the difference in so many different ways. They have better marriages. They are more happy. They have fewer kids. If they're women, they have fewer miscarriages. But crucially, they have much higher incomes. So the point was we could show that for very little money, you can get an incredible bang for your buck and you can do an enormous amount of good. We estimate it's about $45 back on the dollar. Wonderful investment, something that you rarely find. And, the World Bank, everybody else eventually they started using the results that we'd come out with. We'd worked with several Nobel laureates to say this is an incredible investment. And this has become sort of standard thing. I'm not saying we're the only ones responsible because, it was in the air and there were these research results. We helped push this. And, it's one of the things I'm really, really proud of. So once you point out there are smart stuff to do, some of these things are going to happen. That's wonderful. Some of them are just simply too much opposition and it's not going to happen. I'll still try, but we'll probably lose quite a bit of them.
Just on the personal, you see, this is the thing. It's the first time I've ever had the opportunity to talk to you, and this is such an eye-opener. For years, I couldn't understand why you weren't hopping up and down like a madman about having found. I mean, it's basically your Skeptical Environmentalist it's up there with penicillin. It's like it is. You come up with a great argument. And I didn't understand why you weren't more exercised about that, at the resistance to it. And I can see that actually that is sort of part and parcel of the field that you're in, to crystallize arguments, and you just expect there to be resistance. That's been very enlightening for me because, like I said, I'm more of a zealot for your work seemingly than you are, and I can understand why now. It's because I'm a single cell organism, and you actually tried hard at school. So it's
so no. First of all, I think this is a view that I now have after 20 years. I've sort of come to terms with this is how it is. No, I can totally understand your frustration. It's just that I don't think frustration really leads anywhere, and I think talking to people, and especially talking to people that don't agree with me, is what actually helps the world move forward. If I can get people who would tend to believe that I'm an idiot to say that actually makes a little bit of sense, I think that really helps push the world forward as well. Obviously, I also want to give ammunition to people who are already thinking in the way that we're doing. The second thing is, it still frustrates me that people will turn this off in so many ways. But I'm simply saying it would be unreasonable to have expected that you write what you think is yourself think is a great book, and then everybody looks at it and say, "Oh yes, that's really great," and and yeah, all right, note it. That's just not how the world works. And while I still think it should, it's just not how it works, and that's fine. This is about getting some victories, not winning them all.
Sure. Yeah, it's. I want to come on to false alarm. And I said when I kicked off this interview, it seems to me almost, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, it's almost like Skeptical Environmentalist for dummies. It seems to be it seems to be the simplification, if you like, of the argument, the distillation, if you like, of the arguments that were first expounded in Skeptical Environmentalists. I'm not trying to oversimplify. I'm the biggest fan, etc. Is that a fair summary, or am I missing something there?
Well, I think there's two things to this. One is that it's the skeptical environmentalist was much more about the whole world. So it was much about the fact that we've seen life expectancy increase from 32 in 1900 to now 72. We've more than double life expectancy on the planet. Each one of us now have 2 lifetimes instead of 1. How amazing is that? I'm not dwelling on all those things. I actually still mention it in the book, but that's not the main point. This is much more just on climate. I think it's written much more for people who are genuinely, when you read the paper every day, I think most people can't come away without saying, this sounds really, really dangerous. And so I try to give people a sense of why is it you hear stuff that's constantly dangerous, but it's not. So, let me just give you one example. Last year, Washington Post and many other papers across the country and across the world led with the story that a new study showed if we don't do anything about global warming, it'll lead to sea level rise. That will mean 187 million people will have to move. And not surprisingly, very quickly in some other papers, it became they're going to drown. Right. What that story was about was it said if we do nothing over the next 80 years. So basically, if you sit you live close to the sea, sea levels will rise. That's absolutely true. That's a consequence of global warming. And then you just sit there, the waves start lapping up over your knees, and then eventually your hips, and then eventually you drown. That's just an unrealistic description of how the world will work the next 80 years. What the researchers who did the article that said 187 million people said, this is unrealistic, assuming that nothing will change. If we assume that people will be reasonable about the adaptation, so not absurdly exaggerated or excited about adaptation, but just do some adaptation, we estimate that instead of 187 million people flooded, you will see 305,000 people having to move by the end of the century. Just to give you a sense of proportion, that's about half of the number of people that move out of just California every year. So no, we're gonna manage that over the next 80 years for the world. And the point of this story is really just to say, you will hear the 187 million. Because if you're a newspaper editor, what do you want to say? Do you want to say 187 million people are going to drown, or 305,000 people are going to have to move in 80 years? Obviously, you're going to say the first. That's why you hear this scary story. But it's not really scary. It's a problem. And it's one of those problems that we managed many, many times. So again, global warming, not the end of the world. It's a problem. I try to point out that UN climate panel tells us that by the 2070s, so in about 50 years from now, the average person will be 2.63 times as rich as he or she is today. That's their standard scenario. But because of global warming, they tell us, we will be less well off at a point of about 0.2 to 2% less well off. That's the equivalent of all the negative impacts we're going to have from global warming. This is the UN climate panel,
yes,
so the best source we have. So that means instead of us being 2.63 times as rich in 2075, we will only be 2.56 times as rich. That sort of puts in perspective what we're talking about. That's clearly a problem. I would rather be 2.63 times as rich than 2.56 times as rich. But it's also clearly not the end of the world. This is a problem, not a catastrophe. That sort of conversation, and I think my editor has been incredibly good at making this distilled. So instead of skeptical environmentalist for dummies, which somehow makes it sound like it's just cartoons and stuff, it's just the very clear bones of what you need to understand in order to be able to say, why is it everybody talks about this as a catastrophe, and why is it is a problem? And then, of course, I go through all the things that haven't worked. Why doesn't it work to get an electric car? Fundamentally because electric cars are just not cutting carbon emissions all that much. and they cost a lot of money. So basically, we spend about $10,000 to subsidize each electric car. It cuts 10 tons of CO2. For about $50, you could have cut the same amount of CO2 elsewhere. Why would we be spending $10,000 instead of $50 on doing that? Again, it's not saying you shouldn't do something. It's simply to say, let's do the effective things. And that's why I then get to what are the smart things to do. And that's what the third part of the book is. So it's really a walkthrough. Here's why you're scared. Here's why you probably shouldn't be quite as scared. This is what the UN climate panel actually tells you. These are the things that don't work, and this is the stuff that does work. I think it's a little more than a skeptical environmentalist for dummies, but it is a fairly simple and very straightforward argument. And if this wasn't such a controversial argument, I think, as you started out saying, everyone would just go, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, listen, and well, the For Dummies brand. I mean, I think that even the For Dummies brand is not sort of full of cartoons and everything. They just boil things down to the salient points, and I think that that's kind of what I've read in False. It got me through running, how to use a computer basically. So I'm very fond of the For Dummies thing. For me, False Alarm is the most necessary book I think that I've seen from your canon of work so far. Because it is explained in a way that somebody like I can pass on, because as I said, I gave Skeptical Environmentalist, I probably bought you a summer house. I bought so many copies of that. And I only want to just let you go back to saving the world, but I'm just curious, what's the next challenge for you? What comes next for Bjorn Lomborg?
So I think there's a number of things. Partly, I don't think I'm ever going to stop the conversation on climate change. And this is not just, because when you look across the world, so we did, let me just step back a little bit. So the UN back in 2015 did a new set of goals. They had done the Millennium Development Goals. You might have heard of them back in 2000, where they made a very few promises. We're going to cut poverty in half. We're going to stop maternal deaths by 3/4. We're going to get 2/3 of all kids to stop dying. Very simple, smart stuff. Get more water and sanitation to the world. Very simple, smart stuff. They were mostly successful, not everything, but it was a very successful campaign from 2000 to 2015. So they wanted to redo that 2016 to 30. And then they started asking people, what do you want us to focus on? And of course, people said everything, focus on my thing. Oh, focus on my thing. And not surprisingly, at one point, I believe, more than 2,000 ideas of what they should be promising. And so we went to the UN and said, look, we'd love to help you work through what should you actually promise, because some of these promises are going to be very easy and very effectful. Some of these promises are going to be incredibly costly and do almost no good. Why don't we start promising the smart stuff first? They all loved it individually, but of course, they couldn't resist to actually promising everything to everyone. And we told them, don't do that, but that was, of course, what they ended up doing. But we looked at all the things, and that was how we did the Nobel laureates targets to the smartest targets for the world, another book. And what that showed was there's a lot of really, really smart stuff to do. There's a lot of not very smart stuff to do. And unfortunately, if you look at the size of the spending that we have across the world, probably the place where the world wastes the most money now is climate change. And certainly what looks like we're going to do in the future. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this, not because it's sort of a hobby horse for me, but simply because it's where we can actually become most smarter as a human species. We should still fix climate change because it is a problem, but we should start fixing it smartly instead of doing what we're currently doing, spending lots and lots of resources, almost not fixing it. So I'm definitely going to continue on the climate. I also predict that most of this is going to be in vain. There's a very, very strong sense in which, as we talked about, both NGOs, media, and politicians love this for a variety of reasons, as we talked about. Then we're also going to keep focusing on how can we actually help, especially the poor part of the world. So we work with Bangladesh. We've done several states in India. We've done it in Haiti. Now we're working with Ghana. Next year we're going to do Malawi, and there's several other countries that are potentially lined up. So that's what I'm going to be focusing a lot on. One of the beautiful things is, instead of when you talk about what should you do for the world, the problem is you can come up with all these wonderful academic results, but nobody runs the world. Whereas if you talk to somebody who is the president of Ghana, or who is one of the parliamentarians or one of the ministers in Ghana, or just the newspaper editor, or just a regular Ghanaian, if you talk about, look, you can spend $1 here and do a lot of good, you can spend $1 here and not do very much good, what do you want? All of them, in principle, of course, want to do the smart stuff. Now, again, there'll be, well, some of my buddies actually, derive benefit from all that. There's all that kind of stuff, and that happens in all societies. But it's actually easier and simpler to imagine that you actually end up changing spending. And we've certainly done that in Bangladesh. We've also seen some of that in India and Haiti. There's a lot of buy-in in Ghana, and we're looking very much forward to doing this for Malawi as well. So I'm going to stay in the conversation on climate, but I'm also very focused on just simply say, let's get some of those easy wins in some of the countries that really need it.
Oh, that warms my heart. This is going to seem really flippant, and I should have broached it earlier. I'm just curious. Did you ever lose any friends from your findings, from your position that when you came out with a Skeptical Environmentalist?
So certainly at first, I mean, I had friends. This was before, because this was in Denmark. So this was before, it was when the Danish version came out, and it was even before when we published some articles. I had some friends who literally only read everything my opponents said about me.
Right.
And I was like, you're my friends. I mean, shouldn't you at least also read the stuff that I'm writing? And to be frank, I was from a group of people who were very much likely to have been members of Greenpeace, just like I was myself, not, out in the rubber boat, but, paying members and having the posters and all that stuff. So I can understand what happened. And I think most of them ended up coming around, not to the extent that they all agreed with me. I don't think we ever got that far, but to the extent that they agreed that I wasn't being an ass. I was actually trying to make a good point. And they would, agree on some point, grudgingly agree on some points, and certainly disagree on some other points. So no, I don't think I lost any friends. I probably realized a little more that a lot of the people I thought were my friends were certainly also very, very involved in believing that they were saving the world, and they were, somewhat annoyed about being called out on that. But no, I don't have this spectacular story of someone, very close to me that I just lost forever or something. No.
Well, that's a relief, because I wouldn't have been able to sleep if I'd thought that. That's fantastic. Listen, I've taken enough of your time today. Thank you so much, Bjorn Lomborg, for joining us. I urge everybody to read False Alarm. It's just magnificent, absolutely magnificent. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. It was wonderful to be here, and let's have this chat again in a couple of years.
Why a couple of years? What are you doing?
I assume that you don't want to have this chat in a couple of weeks. So,
listen, I'll do the Bjorn Lomborg.
In some appropriate amount of time.
I'll do the Bjorn Lomborg podcast. All right, I'll do it weekly. Anyway,
well, then let's talk about it when we have the Ghana results. I think you might find that interesting. You might find that totally not interesting. It's more interesting if you live in Ghana.
I think obviously. I find everything you're doing more interesting than you do. That's the problem. All right.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
That's the thing. I think we need to add 20% Ben Shapiro to you. I think that's my.
Okay. Yes. I'll take that. The word is under advisement.
That's right. Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been an honor, and I really hope we get to do this again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul.